Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast. I'm Shane Morris, and I don't normally do this, but I want to get personal for a moment here. I really used to pride myself on my ability to talk with people about Christianity and even, to get them to rethink their doubts on occasion. I thought I could pretty well deal with objections that they might raise and that I might actually be something of an okay teacher. And then my wife and I had kids. And I realized that I'm actually woefully underprepared to teach and convey the things that I believe to another mind, especially when that other mind is very easily distracted. And so I've been struggling. And in that process, I've found some help that I want to share with you today. I'm joined by speaker, author, and blogger Natasha Crain. She's the author of Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, 40 Conversations to Help Them Build a Lasting Faith, and Talking with Your Kids About God, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. She's just released a new book for parents entitled Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, 30 Conversations Every Christian Parent Must Have. And I want to talk about both of these outstanding books today. Natasha, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk with you.
Well, you open talking with your kids about God and talking with your kids about Jesus with two really helpful metaphors that I think kind of illustrate the plight that every parent finds themselves in. In the first, you describe how your backyard is the place where plants go to die. And this is due to a lack of consistent watering and fertilizing and, the sun over drying them and so forth. And then you say how when it comes time to, when you realize how bad the plants are doing, you go in and just overwater them and flood them, and it kills them. It's like an all or nothing approach. And then in talking with your kids about Jesus, you describe the frustration that every parent knows of seeing how tidy other people's houses appear to be. And we fall into this error of thinking that, well, they must just have better behaved kids, or that maybe they're super parents or super cleaners. And so we do the same thing to our houses that we do to our plants. We overdo it in these bursts of fevered cleaning. But you say this isn't how clean houses are made. It's not how healthy plants are made. And it's also not how well-informed Christian children are raised. How did you come to that realization? And why is it so liberating? Because I found it truly liberating.
Well, that's great to hear. And yeah, let me just use the analogy from talking with your kids about Jesus and expand on that a little bit. I came across this article on Facebook one day when I was just scrolling, like a lot of us do. I'm just sitting there, and I have always struggled with having a messy house. And I saw this article called 5 Things That Tidy People Don't Do. And so I immediately knew I have to click on this article. So I went into it, and the basic point that I took away from it was this point that said, tidy people don't act like a slob all day and then expect that at the end of the day, they're going to clean everything up in one fell swoop. Instead, tidy people develop these small, non-drastic habits of cleaning a little bit at a time, always as they go. And the article called it low-grade tidying. And to me, that was this giant realization that, yes, in terms of my house cleaning, that could really be helpful. But I also saw in terms of discipleship how relevant that is, because we do get so overwhelmed as parents thinking, okay, I'm going to sit down with a book like the one we're talking about right now, or any other book, and we're going to just really go through it with the kids, and it's going to be this giant project. Maybe we need a week-long retreat with the family or something, but that's so overwhelming. So just like with cleaning, how that doesn't really work, I think we can think of this as low-grade tidying in our homes, spiritually speaking, that these conversations that we need to have with our kids need to happen just as an ongoing way of life. It shouldn't be something that we see as this is a sit down all the time, but rather we're working this in as we go all the time. And it truly becomes just a way of parenting rather than a one-time approach or an event.
You said in a conversation with Jim Daly on the Focus on the Family broadcast that children are more like investments than purchases, that they're something that we build into and invest in year after year after year in anticipation of the final outcome, not something that we can just plonk down a little bit of commitment to or a little bit of time to and then expect some immediate return out of. Talk to us a little bit more about that change of mindset, and then why it's, we spoke about how it's liberating, but I really get this feeling that this is something that will cause parents to breathe a sigh of relief if they truly understand it.
Yeah, this is something that was freeing to me to realize because I think that a lot of us approach parenting with what I would call a purchase mentality that we're going to put in X and Y and then Z is going to happen. And if we don't see Z happen per our expectations, then that means that we failed somehow or that our kids have failed. And when we have those expectations, it will lead to resentment. It will lead to frustration because every parent knows that no matter how great you do, there are still going to be things that happen with your kids that you're like, wait a second, how did this happen? You know, sometimes I think of it as my kids copy 80% of the bad things I do and 20% of the good. I think that's just a general life principle when it comes to parenting. But what changed for me in my mentality, it was so freeing, was when I realized that's not what the Bible calls us to. The Bible's not calling us to this purchase kind of mentality where we're ultimately responsible for our kids' relationship with Jesus. Rather, we're called to make the investment, that we are to talk about truth when we lie down, when we walk along the road, when we
Mm.
sit down, when we get up, you know, the whole Deuteronomy 6 model there. And this is an ongoing way of life, an investment that we're pouring into our kids, but ultimately their relationship with the Lord is between them and God. And so I think when we start to detach the outcome specifically from judging our efforts, we start to have that liberating sense of, okay, God is sovereign. I'm going to be obedient and I'm going to teach my kids as I should. I'm going to pour into them and invest in them. But ultimately, that outcome will be between them and God.
So walk us through how a typical conversation with your kids should go, and we're going to get into a couple of the examples here in the book. But give us the basic outline. What does it look like when a kid approaches, when your child approaches you with a question or an objection or something like that, and then what is the right response to that?
Well, that could be a lot of different things because it would depend on the context and the specific question that they're
Right.
asking. But maybe a couple of things that would help parents to get thinking about this is number one, if you have no idea how to answer it, because I think that that's the first thing that comes to parents' minds, like, yeah, I don't even know how to approach the answer myself. How will I pass this on?
Hmm.
It's great to first acknowledge, hey, this is a great question that you've asked. I'm really glad that you asked it. I'm not really sure the best way to answer that question. So let's look for an answer together. And it's going to be a good opportunity for us to look at good ways to go about finding answers to things and not so good ways. Because, of course, what do you think kids are going to do today if they want an answer? They're going to go onto Google, right? And they're not necessarily going to find the best answers, the most informative, fact based answers there. So, if you don't know the answer to a question that comes up, it is far, far better to acknowledge that and use it as a teaching opportunity than to offer an answer that maybe is inaccurate, because that can actually set them up for some misunderstandings that later snowball into something much bigger. So I always encourage parents, it's better to say, I'm not sure, let's find out, rather than the opposite of giving an answer that's incorrect. Now, if you do know the answer, it's also a very good practice to start by asking your kids some questions, because I think sometimes when a child asks a question, we think that we know what they mean and we start answering something and going into
Right.
it, and then we realize, wait a second, maybe that's not actually it. So for example, if a child asks something like, how do I know that God exists? Maybe if you've looked at some of this evidence for God's existence before, it's tempting to start going down the road of, well, let's talk about the Kalam cosmological argument and all this stuff. But if you just slow yourself down and you take a second to ask some questions like, well, what's brought that to your mind today? This is such a good question. I'm just curious, what you got you thinking about this.
Hmm.
Maybe the child answers, well, I've been praying about something and it didn't happen. So how do I know that God's actually there? Those would be very different conversations. And if you had gone about talking about the fine tuning of the universe, you are a universe away from what they're actually talking about. So taking the time to ask those questions then would lead you to figure out, okay, this is more conversation about prayer. What does the Bible say about prayer? What does it not say? And so in both of those examples, I think whether you don't know the answer or you do know the answer, digging in a little bit more to understand what's really going on behind the question is key.
It's like you're doing a little bit of detective work there to find that
Yes.
underlying question that they're really asking. And then there's a difference too that you bring up between questions and just sort of statements or objections that your kids will sometimes throw out. And we have to be careful in the same way with these as well, because they may be saying something that you don't think that they're initially saying. So, for instance, I mean, you tell a story about, was it your son or your daughter who said that they hate God?
My
at some
son.
point.
I was
So
just thinking of that
my son
example when you
said
said that.
something very similar not too long ago. He actually said, "I don't believe in God." He's 5 years old. And after I sort of, probed a little bit, it came out that he was just very angry at something that had happened earlier, and he wanted to get a rise out of me and his mother. And the response is going to look a little bit different to that. And then he came back to me later and he said, "I don't really believe that. I do believe in God. I was just trying to make you guys angry, in not in so many words, but in his 5-year-old way." And how do we respond to that sort of thing? So it's not a question; it's more of a statement. Sometimes in order to get a rise out of you.
That is a great question because that is so true, especially as your kids get older. So I have 11-year-old twins and I have a 9-year-old. And the older they get, the closer they get to becoming teenagers, the more they do want to get a rise out of you. And so sometimes they're just dropping bombs at you to just see what you'll say. And a couple of things that I found helpful. Number one, my kids know what I do in terms of writing books and ministry. So they know that if they really want to get under my skin, then they can challenge me on something, related to faith. And so I come to expect that. And number one, I don't want to ever seem shocked by it. So if my daughter is going to, come to me, or my son's going to come to me and say like, I don't want to go to church. I hate church, whatever the case may be. I'm going to complain about church. We'll use that as an example. I'm not going to be shocked about it.
We've had that one,
Okay. I think every parent has had that one, especially,
right?
watching live online church and stuff right now with the quarantine. I know I've been there. But when they say that, don't be shocked by it. Don't overreact, because the more that we overreact, the more that it registers in your kid's mind. I've got something now. This is important to mom and dad. I can always hang this over their head. So I don't overreact. And I also recognize that a lot of times this is about a mood. This can be something that's just specific to that day. If your kid's in a bad mood, they're going to complain about everything. They're going to want to get you upset about things. And so if it's one of those kinds of days and I'm sensing that that's what's going on, then I'll just say something like, I'm sorry that you feel that way. If you want to talk about it later, and this is something that is honestly on your mind and you're not just feeling upset right now, I'd love to talk about it. Obviously right now is not the time. Timing is everything with parenting. And I think especially so when we come to having these conversations about faith matters. But if you really get the sense that they're starting to have questions, and then when they drop off these comments, they're trying to let you know that, they're having a lot of doubts and whatnot, find the right time. And maybe that's at nighttime, maybe it is, before school, whatever it is, whatever is most comfortable for you as a family, and just say, hey, you mentioned earlier about this. I'm just curious, do you really feel like that? And
Hmm.
just to kind of, again, ask those questions to get into it. So I think I just break that down into two parts. That number one, if they're dropping off a comment just because they want to get under your skin, don't overreact, and make sure that you kind of talk later if you think that's a thing. But if they're dropping it off and you feel like that's something that you need to talk about, then ask more questions at another time.
We're talking about 60 different conversations here between the two books: how to talk to your kids about God, and then how to talk to your kids about Jesus, which is the one that has just come out this year. And these books are just written so well. They've got so much, research behind them. It's clear that you've prepared extremely well. But how did you make the choices to include these particular conversations? What was it that drew you to them and helped you distinguish between what needs to be in the book and what doesn't?
Yeah. So the theme of across all my books is that these are conversations that parents specifically need to have with their kids, given the challenges in today's world.
Mm.
So the titles sound kind of broad, talking with your kids about God or Jesus. That could cover a whole lot of ground, obviously. But these conversations I've picked are the ones that are most important for kids given these challenges. And so I've experienced those in the last few years. I started off as a blogger back in 2011, not even knowing what the word apologetics meant, that I was challenged on my own blog by skeptics of Christianity. And as they came along and said things that I'd never heard before as a lifelong Christian, things like the Bible's filled with errors and contradictions, Jesus never existed as a person in history, all these kinds of things, I started to dig in and learn about apologetics myself, how we make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity. So I've had a long road over the last few years of kind of seeing what skeptics are saying and engaging with those kinds of challenges, and then also engaging with parents. I have a lot of different Facebook groups that I have for parents, and through my blog's Facebook page. So I've heard so much about the challenges that kids are facing today. And then in addition to that, there's a lot of research around these things. So Barna Group especially has done a ton of research in the last few years about why kids are leaving the faith. At least 60% of kids are walking away from Christianity today by their early 20s. 20s. And researchers then go on to say, well, why? It's not just here's a fact about a youth exodus. It's and here's what's really drawing them away. And they look at these kinds of intellectual challenges. And so a lot of those things you can see reflected in the books as well. So it's kind of a pool from all of those, from the personal experience from talking to and engaging with many thousands of parents over the last several years, and then also research that's been done about what kids are facing.
So here's how the books work. Each one is broken up into parts. So in the one about God, you group conversations into the existence of God, science and God, the nature of God, believing in God, and the difference God makes. And then you deal with subjects beneath each one of those headings, like where did life come from? And do science and religion contradict each other? And why does God seem so harsh in parts of the Old Testament? And do all religions worship the same God? And then the same sort of structure holds true for the book about Jesus as well. My question is, how do parents approach these books? Because it seems like the initial idea I got is that I want to read through this whole thing myself and then have conversation by conversation, almost in order as they appear in the books. But I imagine they could also be used as a reference, right? So sort of look up the question or the conversation that's come up with your child. Which one do you recommend most?
Well, I agree. They're designed to be sequential so that when you read the chapters, they build on each other. And so, ideally, parents should read through the whole book themselves so that they're getting the big picture. They're getting equipped with this understanding, and it's laid out in a very specific format to kind of walk you through these subjects in an order that makes a lot of logical and theological sense. And so, that's the best starting point. Now, if you are in a position, maybe you're a homeschooling parent where you have the flexibility of doing this sort of as a curriculum, which I'm going to do next year. I'm turning into a homeschool parent myself starting in the fall, and I'm going to just cover a chapter a week with my kids, going through the book myself with them in that order. Then that's great because they can get that same benefit of seeing it all laid out. But I know that for a lot of parents, maybe who are just kind of wanting to have these conversations over dinner time or on the way to school, in the car, whatever it might be, that you can't necessarily do it in such a structured way. So in that case, it's absolutely possible to look up a specific question and then have that particular conversation with your kids. But the important thing is that if you've read the book, you've gotten equipped with that understanding so that you can take advantage of moments as you see them. And you can say, oh, they're raising this question about how we even know Jesus is God. Okay, I got that one in my head, right? I read about that, and then you can use it. So there are a lot of different ways, and it's intended to be something that you can go back to over time as a reference.
Natasha, I love the way each conversation is broken into explanations of the topic for parents, first of all. So you get this sort of 30,000-foot familiarity with the subject. And then that's something that we can read and digest in just a few minutes per topic. And then you go into conversation guides for talking about this stuff with our kids. So there's a conversation opener, and then there's questions that point us, along our way, how to have that conversation with our kids. And then at the end, you actually have sort of a challenge or an application question where there's a common objection that a skeptic might offer against the faith. And then your kids have the chance to go back and address that objection and answer it using what they've just learned. What do you typically see happen in the lives of kids when they walk through this process with their parents? How does it, what are the tangible ways that it changes things for them?
Well, I think for one, it gives some spiritual credibility to parents so that their kids can see, look, my parents aren't just blindly believing something and they don't want to just force their beliefs upon me, but rather they want me to understand what other people believe.
Hmm.
And they're not just trying to force this stuff on me. They want me to understand that there are other views out there. And I think that alone speaks volumes, because if Christianity is true, then we have nothing to fear. And that says a lot for our homes when we're encouraging them to hear from skeptics. Every chapter in these books addresses what skeptics are saying. And so it shows our kids that, we don't have to worry about, looking at these things. We don't have to feel like we have to hide off in a silo or something. Let's talk about it. Let's get it out in the open. So as kids process these questions and they see what skeptics are saying, they realize that mom and dad aren't hiding something from me. And actually, there's good reason to believe Christianity is true. And so it gives them an opportunity to think, to ask those questions, and to hear about questions maybe they haven't thought of yet. And that's a huge important thing today, because we don't want our kids to just wait to ask us questions. We want to bring the big questions that people are asking to them, knowing that they're going to hear those things eventually.
It seems to me like so much of apologetics is actually getting the message out there, because these questions have been answered before. I mean, they've been dealt with, and so much of the problem is that children and even Christian adults in the church just don't know the answers. And so this is that process of applying it. And a lot of the objections to Christianity that actually lead people out of the faith, even at a young age, have a sort of initial plausibility to them. Like when someone asks, an example I've heard you give is when someone asks, well, why should we believe that Jesus is the only way of salvation? Can't we just say that all religions are basically true? And then, authors like J. Warder Wallace and Tim Keller and a whole host of other apologists have gone through and dealt with this objection. But it does have that initial plausibility. It does sound like maybe, well, that's a very generous and open-minded thing to believe, and it can capture the attention of particularly teenagers. When you're answering that, though, it's amazing how simple the response is, and how intuitive that response sounds. So walk us through that one, that particular objection. If your child comes to you and says, why shouldn't we have Muslim neighbors, we have Hindu neighbors, why shouldn't we believe that their faith is just as valid as ours? Can't they all be true?
Right. Well, I think that the most helpful thing that we can do is to explain to our kids that this is, again, is a very good question. And a lot of people today believe this, but we have to look at what each of those religions is claiming. And when we do that, when we sit down and just say, okay, what do they believe about God? What do they believe about where we came from, where we're going, who we are, why we're here? When we look at each religion's answers to these basic questions, we see that they cannot logically be true at the same time, because they offer logically contradictory answers to these big questions. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't have some commonalities between them, but even when we see that maybe they teach similar morals, and two religions say, well, do not murder, when we actually sit down and kind of look at a checkbox of all these worldview questions, we can see, no, these can't be true at the same time. In Judaism, Jesus was not the Messiah. In Christianity, Jesus is the Messiah. Those two things cannot be true at the same time. So one is true and one is false. And so I think that when we actually take the time to look at this on paper almost and say, well, let's just see what they both teach, it becomes clear, okay, no, these cannot all be true at the same time, even if it sounds good in the beginning. And I think you're so right about that so many of these questions can sound plausible in the beginning, but it only takes a little bit of work with our kids to show, no, this actually doesn't work. And it should lead us to the question of, well, how would we know if one of these is true? Because if one is, then that's going to change everything about how we view the world and our lives.
This is really a chance for parents to re-catechize themselves as much as it's a chance for us to catechize our kids, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And even those of us who have been in church our whole lives sometimes haven't gotten into these kinds of questions. And that was certainly the case for me when I started blogging in 2011. I'd been a lifelong Christian, but I had never heard these kinds of challenges before. And I had no idea how to answer them. If somebody said that Christianity and science were somehow in conflict, I didn't even know what they were talking about at the time. I just thought, well, of course they're not in conflict. Why would anyone say that? But there's a whole, giant bubble under that of all kinds of claims and worldviews and things that when you really get into that you start to see differently. And by and large, the church isn't talking about a lot of these questions. And so that's how I hope that my books will help parents, is to go beyond maybe the basics that they're hearing or learning in your average Bible study and see, hey, there's a whole world out there of challenges to Christianity. Here's what we can say in response. Here's how we make the case for Christianity and defend it.
I love the way you also help break down some thorny questions and don't necessarily come down with a definitive answer on some of them. And the one that stood out to me in the book about God was the origins debate, where you deal with the question of whether science contradicts the Bible and Christianity. And then you say, well, okay, here's where there is no contradiction. Here's where it's clear that Christianity is the basis for a rational faith and a scientific faith. And then here's where there are some contradictions between modern scientific consensus and a particular interpretation of the Bible. And then you say, well, here's what some Christians say. Here's what other Christians say. The faith does not stand or fall on this point, but here are some sort of the direction you can take in either stance for interpreting the Bible. The one thing we have to say is that the Bible properly interpreted and natural revelation properly interpreted will ultimately agree, that there's not going to be a contradiction between those. And we hold that both sides hold that as a matter of faith. I really like the way you do that. And it's parents need permission to do that too, don't we? I mean, we need permission to teach our kids that, okay, here's what we believe. Here are the essentials of the faith, but here are the sort of secondary matters that Christians disagree on, like church polity or the sacraments, or the matters that pertain to the Reformation. And these are not that primary level issue. These are the secondary issues that are important, very important, but it's not something that Christianity stands or falls on. It's not something that that a skeptic shouldn't be able to come to you and say, well, this particular apologist is wrong about the age of the earth, therefore Christianity is finished, right?
Exactly. Yes, and that's a huge thing that I see today, is that a lot of people will make Christianity hinge on one of these types of issues. But I think that we have to bring our kids back always to 1 Corinthians 15:14, where Paul says that if Christ has not been raised, our faith is in vain. This is the truth test for Christianity. And I think that that's extremely important for kids to understand. If Jesus was raised from the dead, then he was who he said he was. He is the creator and the sustainer of the universe. He has all authority for our lives, and everything changes. If he wasn't raised from the dead, then none of this matters. And sometimes today, a lot of people have gotten this confused, and you'll see skeptics, for example, say that, well, I've never seen an amputee grow back a leg, and therefore clearly God doesn't exist. Well, that's not promised in the Bible. That's not the truth test for Christianity. The truth test for Christianity isn't a specific view of the age of the earth or a specific view of some of the other things that you mentioned. Is very specifically the resurrection. And I think giving our kids this just laser focused understanding of that is a really important point for them. And in terms of the age of the earth, just to put it out there, my first book, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side, actually has 8 chapters that just lay out objectively as possible, the scriptural and scientific case for and against each of these different views. So that was something, that's how I kind of got started with apologetics, actually, was looking into that in particular. And I found it so hard to find a good resource that would lay out those things without making a case for one view. And so that's really what I was hoping to help parents with there.
And then, of course, we tend to bundle issues too, don't we? I mean, we talk about creation versus evolution or something like that. But within that issue is a whole host of different sub issues that we need to distinguish between and deal with. I mean, there's naturalism versus a supernaturalist worldview. There's the age of the earth. There's philosophy questions about how we do science, about what it means to recognize intelligence in the design of nature. All of those questions need to be dealt with distinctly, and it's another thing that's so valuable, I think, about your books. Here's a question that I had that you probably haven't been asked before, but as the father of a daughter and 2 boys, it really came to mind for me. Do you think there's a difference in the way that boys and girls question and explore the Christian faith?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good question. So I have 2 girls and a boy. And so I guess my thoughts about this would be anecdotal, but I think that it probably rings true for a lot of parents that boys might not process as much out loud, whereas girls are more interested in the conversation a lot of times. And, these are generalizations, so it might not be true in any given case. But I think that for a lot of boys, it's not so natural to say, hey, I'm really thinking about this question tonight. Can you help walk me through it? That doesn't happen as much as with a girl who might say, how do I even know that this happened? Or, did Jonah really swallow somebody? And so I think that some of that expressiveness that you tend to see being different between the genders, it kind of comes out with kids. And so what does that mean? What implications does that have for us as parents? I think that we have to really be careful with boys, especially, to not assume that if they don't have questions that they're verbalizing, that they don't actually have any questions. And so I think that's a really big thing for us to go back and say, hey, let's have a questions night. And we've done this a lot of times as a family, where we just say, what questions do you have about anything? God, Jesus, the Bible, just whatever you want to ask, and put that format out there, because boys especially won't necessarily just come to you with that. So that's just one, type of difference that I would see.
In the book on Jesus, in particular, the one that just came out, talking to your kids about Jesus, you get into Chalcedonian Christology. You get into the distinctions between person and nature, and how Jesus fits into this picture of the Trinity that we've inherited from the forefathers of the faith. Many parents are going to be encountering this for the first time. Where did you go to find out about this stuff? How did you accrue the knowledge that you then put into this book to help parents talk with their kids about these things?
Oh, well, a lot of different places actually. It wasn't just one resource, but I think that's that's what's so hard about all of this. It's a basic question about how can Jesus be both God and human? That's
Mm.
a really big thing that a lot of times kids struggle with. Like, what exactly does that mean? And did God die on the cross? Or these questions that we actually get. But to understand them kind of requires a little theology from this discipline over here. It's like you said, it's a multi-layered kind of thing, and it requires little apologetics from over here. So you kind of have all these different places that in order to answer a given question, you have to go to. And so I've kind of worked through that over the last few years on these different issues. And I am a really big reader. So I've read tons and tons of books across all these things. So I'm kind of pulling from different places. But again, that's how I hope that I'm helping parents so that they don't have to go to 1,000 different places to get the
Mm.
information. I've taken the best resources that I've found over time from all of my reading and then succinctly put it into a book format.
And as R.C. Sproul said, everyone's a theologian. We all have a duty to understand
Yes.
these things, and they are understandable. We can grasp the fundamental truths of the faith and pass them on to our kids. Here's a question that I think may be on the minds of many. Talk to the parent who feels like it's too late, that they've messed up too badly, and that their plants are dead, so to speak. Their house is a mess. They have not raised their child as they would have chosen to if they could do it again. What do you say to that parent? How do they start over?
Yeah, it's never too late. There's never a point where we cannot be influential in our kids' lives, including when they're out of the house. Yeah, I've had a lot of parents actually email me who have been reading my books and they say, this is helpful for my adult children. I didn't do all of this. I wish that I did when they were younger, but now when we have these conversations, they're not walking with the Lord. And I just don't know really how to engage with that without sounding too overbearing and this kind of thing. And so it's never too late. It's never too late to talk to your neighbors. It's never too late to talk to anyone else. So why would it be too late to talk with our kids? Now, if your kids are still at home and you're saying, well, it's too late, they're teenagers or whatever the case may be, then you have to realize, wait, there is still plenty that you can do. And I think it starts with just being honest with your kids about the fact that you wish you had done more. Because if you've not been having these conversations and you haven't been having a lot of just spiritual development going on in your home, and you suddenly start quoting Bible verses and you're suddenly saying, we're going to have Bible study night, your kids are going to be like, what's going on? This is a little crazy. Like, what happened to mom and
Yeah.
dad here? So I think just starting and saying, you know what, I really feel like I have missed the boat in the last few years, like with teaching you guys a lot about some of the big faith questions that you need to understand today. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world. There are all kinds of things you're going to hear. I'm sure you've wondered before, how do we even know Christianity is true? And just kind of acknowledge those things and then say, so I really want to have more of those conversations, and I don't want you to think it's weird. And so I'm just telling you, this is why we're going
Mm.
to talk about this. And I want you to know that whatever questions you have, I want to talk about those. If you have doubts or maybe you're having trouble, whatever, I want to talk about those things. And everything is open here. So just having that kind of conversation can be really, really helpful as a starting point. And don't feel like you have to hit your kids over the head with some giant book. We're going to study apologetics now, and here is the biggest book I could find, and we're going to read it together. Just start small. If you used my book, for example, these chapters are 4 or 5 pages each, and you could just talk about maybe one chapter a week together and just go through these things. And there are lots of other great apologetics resources out there too. If your kids like videos, you can find tons of videos. You can find great podcasts from different ministries. So pick one thing and try to start there rather than overwhelming your kids.
I've been talking today with Natasha Crain, author of Talking with Your Kids About God and Talking with Your Kids About Jesus. I can't recommend these books enough. These are really exciting resources and something that I'm just thrilled to have as a parent of young children, trying to figure out how to do all the stuff that I thought I knew how to do um, as I raise my kids in the faith. So come to breakpoint.org and we'll tell you how you can get a copy of each of these books. I also want to mention that Natasha is also a featured speaker in our Truth Love Together virtual event. And she talks about teaching kids about the faith in a noisy world. You can register for that for free. You just got to go to conference.colsoncenter.org and you can find all the information you need there. Natasha, thank you so much for joining me today on the Breakpoint podcast. This has been just a rich and helpful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great talking with you.